writer, I'm a critic for the New York Times, and I'm an overall fan of Dominique's. And is Professor Soyica Colbert, who is the chair of the Department of Performing Arts, director of theater and performance studies, and a professor of African American studies at Georgetown University. She has a lot of books, but for our purposes, she's the author of The African American Theatrical Body, Perception, Performance, and Stage, Black Movements, Performance and Cultural Politics. Another book she co-edited was The Psychic Hold of Slavery, and she also has her latest book on Ray Hansberry. In the middle is Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin, who is the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia University. She is the author of many, many books, but Who Set You Flowing? The African American Migration Narrative, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery in Search of Billie Holiday, Harlem Nocturne, and I didn't put your latest book, which has the most beautiful title, Read Until You Understand, which is a really a memoir and literary criticism, looking at our great writers and thinkers in African American thought. And I guess I should just say, my first book was called Sites of Slavery, and I looked at slavery and how people remember, contemporary writers think about slavery in the moment. So I think that fits into this conversation in great ways. Okay, so let's just jump right in, because we fit into this very elite category. There's only 1% of all professors in the United States are Black women who are full professors. So it's a very rare category to be able to access and to be in. And there's a number of reasons why it's such a limited number of us who can get that far. And I think that this play really speaks to that. But I want to start with two quotes that end this piece here. So Sandra says, "This is what it means to be at this institution, to know deep in your core that there will never be justice for you here." And Sarah says, "This is what it means to be in a peculiar institution, under its boot, everybody your enemy." And so I was wondering if you can talk about these parallel worlds of antebellum South and the plantation and academia, and what stood out to you with those twin worlds eventually coming together at the end. But the play, they slowly start coming together throughout the play. So what was your immediate response as people who survived one of those peculiar institutions?
A couple of things. So I love that at the end there was an embodied response that then pulled them together, because I know that Black women often internalize physically the maladies of their institutions, and they manifest in a physical way. And so it was interesting to me that that was a choice, and also important, because on the one hand, there's the expression of strength via the body, but then you also see how the pain is internalized. The other piece about navigating the academy, I also recently was an interim dean at Georgetown. I thought a lot about something that Fred Moten, a scholar at NYU, asked us to think about whether or not transformation of institutions is possible, or whether or not we should focus on loopholes of retreat in the way that the narrative of life, the way that Harry Jacobs talks about, and sort of carving out these little spaces underground where we can flourish. And for me, often focusing on that aspect of just figuring out what are the spaces that I can carve out that are possible, as opposed to trying to change the whole institution, made things more livable.
No, that's, there's so much that resonates with what you just said, Soyica, but I think one of the things that I thought about was, this sense of advancement that, 1%, like, we even say like it's a very elite group, but the question I think that the play raises is, at what cost, right? At what cost, and what are the relationships between, not that it's the same thing, clearly, and not that things haven't changed and the professor is, Sarah, not that at all, but that there is a relationship between the past and the present. There is a legacy. And one of the things that I thought was really discomforting for me was that part of that legacy was the distrust, right? That the distrust isn't like, it's almost a given that the institution is problematic, right? That's the given. But that then there's this distrust and not really knowing, being able to know who your kinfolk are, right? Or always, the fact that she's always questioning which one, who might it be? It could be anybody. That to me is an almost devastating legacy that we see sort of get played out here with all the humor in the world, because it is a funny play too. But yeah.
So this was something, because before we saw the play, we were trying to figure out why it's called The Confederates, and then there's a line when Sarah's saying, you know, the white kin are they're the Confederates to each other, and then you know we looked at the Confederate and another way of thinking about Confederates as accomplice, which is the opposite in some ways of kin. So I was curious if we could just think a little bit about that tension, like kin functions differently when we're in the plantation. You know, obviously it's her literal brother, and then that's kind of the appeal that Luann makes to her, and then ostensibly that works in the end. They seem to destroy the plantation together. But then in the contemporary period, only one character, Professor Banks, is using that term kin, but there's a way in which all these other characters are trying to access these points of solidarity, whether it's feminism, whether it's racial solidarity, and then with Professor Banks, it's multiple forms of kinship that she's trying to. So what did you think of that? Like, what does it mean? Like, it is just, it's uncomfortable, but also there's the Confederacy, the Confederates as the accomplices and or traitors, and then you have kin. So what did you make of, as literary critics, I guess, you know, it's an interesting point that the play keeps on coming back to.
I think it draws me back to Farah's point about the devastating nature of distrust, but also that at the end, the professor comes through for everyone. She ends up writing the letter, she ends up rewriting the paper. And so in some ways, as the other characters try to be accomplices with her, she still remains this centered figure who can't really be kin to any of them because there's all this alienation that surrounds her. And so it's a really complicated relationships, both in terms of time, you know, across the two sets of characters, but then internally within the present and the past. And it makes you wonder what type of institutional structures would allow for a better understanding or them being able to see in each other across their differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that the play left for me was in the historical period, the you know, with the enslaved, like Sarah talks about having deep love, and she says, I know what deep love is, like my mother, my brother. And you don't get the sense that she's alone, right? And that even there are these points where, because one of the other definitions of Confederate is accomplice, right? Or that there are points where she comes together with Miss Sarah, or I mean, what's her name? Miss Susan, right? She comes together with her, or she comes together with Luann. They come together for something, and that just felt like in the contemporary moment, the professor comes through, but I felt like she was sort of floundering on her own. Like her marriage is falling apart. There is no talk of family relationships outside of her institutional work. Or, you know, one of the things I think we all experience being professors is that we build these little spaces in the institution, or we try to transform the institution, but we're all engaged in stuff outside of the institution. We're all engaged in communities outside of the institution. And I you know, she doesn't have that either. So she felt much more alone to me in some ways than the historical figure did.
Yeah, it's like, you know, I've been watching Severance a lot, and so there's this way in which, like, the contemporary, we're like, where's but obviously Trump, there's a lot I can do, but I'm not gonna do it. But the idea of the contemporary laborer being, you know, it's like Marx taken to the extreme, but the contemporary laborer being completely alienated. And so what does it mean, even at the level of academia, to be as part of a, you know, a workforce in which you have no connection to anything else, that you're simply there in service of the institution. So I think that's actually like interesting to see this Black woman professor as that kind of character. The other thing I was thinking of, and we've been talking about this, is like there's like this new archetype of the Black woman professor as a character in film, mostly by Black people. I think it's a lot of Black writers who are imagining that. So, there's the film Master that's on Amazon right now. There also is, How to Get Away with Murder, obviously with Viola Davis. But there's a lot of new shows like Harlem, Run the World. This is not by a Black writer, but the TV show The Chair, which is on Netflix. And so when we were trying to trace a lineage, and then we were going back to like Kathleen Collins and Losing Ground and that wonderful film of hers, which is this seems to me the academic as the intellectual versus the academic as Black woman academic as someone straddling these two worlds. So why do you think there's this like interest? Because we've been in academia for a minute now and haven't always been seen as worthy or interesting enough to be on the screen or on the stage. And so, what's going on? What do you guys think is going on?
Can I just pick up really quickly on one of the things you said at the beginning, which was in service to the institution? I think that racialized and gender identities also get deployed and cordoned off in service to the institution. And so the shirt becomes the, idiom with which to describe that. And I also think that in terms of genealogy, one of the things that opens up with the talk of affirmative action in the play is, this window that's briefly opened in the 70s where Black people have greater access than they had historically to institutions. And now that window has, closed again, but the generation of playwrights and artists that you're describing were born, coming of age during that period. And so they were part of this generation of Black artists who had access to higher education, who have gone on to get higher degrees. And it might be in some ways them making sense of their own experiences with a different relationship to institutions, whether they be the academy or otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's also because, I'm older than either of these two youngins. It was so rare. Like, no one could have ever told me that somebody would be interested enough in a Black woman professor to do anything, like write a book about us or, I'm like, Oprah won't even have us on her show. Like, this moment is really, it's interesting, it's exciting. And I also think, why not? Because it's a totally kind of unimagined character, right? We can imagine the singer. We can imagine all kinds of, different types of Black women. But I think that for creative people, imagining the professor or the Black woman intellectual, the writer, is like a whole new archetype. And so one can invest it with all kinds of meaning. Just because it's so in some ways so unfamiliar, right? It's becoming more familiar. In some ways, I think it might start being more familiar in the culture than it actually is in the institution, right? Because there still aren't that many of us in the institution.
And this idea, the characters here are projecting so much onto her, so she's just like a gestalt, like just captivating, even though she's obviously a human being. I think that's really kind of compelling about seeing her on the stage and all that she's grappling with. I want to open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions. I have some other ones in case we don't have anything, but I just want to, and you have to project, you have to like speak loudly so we can hear you because there's no mic going around.
Just in terms of the last thing you were talking about, why would this moment be a moment where people might be interested in Black women professors as characters? The world of academia has become harder to penetrate right now, I think. It's one of the harder, you don't get paid all. It's an institution that's deeply entrenched and was for a long time mostly white and male. And so it's sort of the epitome of the, rampart that you wham against, so I think the fact that Black women are there at all seems maybe amazing to playwrights, both Black and white, and to the people who are in the schools looking at their teachers and saying, how did this happen? How is this happening? Why is this happening? how are they reaching this very hard place to reach? And I've heard a lot of negative comments over the, recently from people in academia thinking it's all affirmative action. So
Yeah, I think thank you for that. And that was kind of related to the thought I had. I think we've all experienced being the first Black woman teacher for white students. That's a really crazy thing. Like when they come into the classroom, or many of them come into the classroom, and we're the first time that they've seen a Black person, a Black woman in a position of authority, both intellectual and also determining their fate in that moment. And there's a lot at stake in that. And so I guess that's also what the play, like you're saying, it's so rare, but also that encounter is actually so rare in America still. And so that's obviously why it's so important for everyone to have as diverse a student, the teacher body as possible from the very beginning. But I don't know, do you had that moment when you realized you're like the first time they've seen a Black woman? It was like,
we will have I think there will be more people who have seen them maybe on television than have actually seen, actually, and then it also is, the way the academy works. I mean, some students, you can still go through your whole education and never be taught by a Black woman or a Black man for that matter. You can go through your whole education, and even though there are pockets of folk here and there.
I'm curious of what your individual experiences with navigating that students wanting to like be close to you, but also being objective to their performance. And if the play felt real to you all. And yeah, I think that's my question.
yeah, and the idea of I think you introduced this to me, the idea of the Black woman professor as the mammy.
She's always saying I introduced her to stuff. It's true. So I think that, and I'd be interested to see what the two of you think, but I do think that, you do have a sense that you are, particularly if you're in a predominantly white institution, right, that you're there for all your students, but that your Black students need something more, but that you also are doing them a disservice if you don't hold them to the standard that they should be held to, and help them, all of your students, but that you have to maintain a sense of standards, a sense of rigor, a sense of excellence. That's the service that you have to provide them as well. But I do think that sometimes there's a different set of expectations that all students have. So a lot of this did ring true, and I think the part that rang true to me was that everybody thought she was biased against them. That's the part that felt so true. You're in favor of the Black man. No, you like the white women. So that part kind of rang true.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think that one of the things that's hard is there's an expectation that you will do care work in ways different for all your students, not just the Black students. And so then her coworker said, "Oh, I overstepped." It's like, I remember one time someone came to my office and said, "I know I'm coming in, I'm like a colonizer right now, but I need you to do this for me." And I thought to myself, well, you're coming in with that spirit. Why were you using the quality and reevaluate what you're about to ask me to do? Right? So, I mean, so the fact that you're not doing that and you're going to proceed to ask me for the thing that you know is already out of line. Okay, so I think that there's an expectation of a kind of care work that you're for the institution, for your students, for your coworkers, for everyone in your orbit. And it's very clear that for me, I co-taught with people and co-taught with men and see how my students approach me and see how they approach my co-teacher. And so, very direct parallels in seeing those interactions. I do also think that this has created like mentorship opportunities and relationships I have with some of my students that I continue to have that are very that feed me, and that I'm very happy that I have had those opportunities. But I do recognize that there's a certain level of labor involved that we're called to do.
Thanks for sharing that with humor.
So I know that you were talking about how, like the concept of women Black professors, how like, there's almost kind of like that, the 1% and like how it's becoming more popular in fiction. But even in thinking about, I guess, like the resolution of the play for both Sarah and the professor, there was still, I feel like this element of kind of like how we still have to be resilient through everything. And I guess, do you see any space, or I guess any trends in this space that just like gives Black women like space to be vulnerable and weak? Like we see it in the moment where she's talking about how she's unraveling and she doesn't want anybody to see it, but it still feels like kind of the resolution at the end, like whether it's burning down the mansion or being like, I'm not your Negro anymore, it's like, I'm tired, I just want to take a break sometimes, and like, how do we get more space to just, we don't have to like fight back or be, angry, like, how can we just be?
Yeah, I wonder how you two would answer this question. I think for me, I'm really very public as being a sexual assault survivor. And so I created a whole organization around it. I have a performance that we travel the country with that talks about my healing. And so it's a very non-academic identity of mine. Even now I think it's, it's all merging, but I always had that as like a parallel for me when I was in grad school and when I was a junior professor and now as a full professor. So I think for me, I've always had an ability to have a vulnerability in public, but that's different than how I maybe show up in the classroom or I just show up on my 10-year file. That was part of it, my work, but it doesn't count towards tenure. And I remember being at a public presentation performance at Princeton, and there was a faculty member in the audience, and she was like, aren't you afraid of being penalized for this? And I was like, well, this work is not supposed to be determined by academia. Like, that's such a low standard, really. I mean, my scholarship can be, but not this work, which was, at the time I saw as my activist work. So I think I figured out a way to be vulnerable to a certain degree, because it's a very vulnerable thing. But I don't think you're right. Like, I don't know if there's, I'm curious what you all say. There's not a lot of way to be multidimensional in that way in academia. And I was thinking like my lowest teaching scores only came when I was co-teaching with 2 men. And I was like, and I'm like a really, open, free teacher. And yet I don't think I was, so I still had to be reserved to show authority. I mean, there's ways in which we have to kind of hold our authority differently than our male colleagues, Black male colleagues in my case too.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I'm thinking so many things. One, I think that for me, the space where I've been able to be most vulnerable has been in the community that I've created with other Black women scholars, and both within my institution and nationally and internationally, and the mentors. And also I think and I think it was especially true of my cohort, is that the cohort right before us, we saw the price that they paid in their physical health. And some of them, had very short lives. And these were people we loved and admired and read and, who had mentored us. And so I think that made us much more aware of not having to perform resilience all the time. But even having said that, in my experience, no one can basically come undone, really come undone without there being tremendous costs, except white male professors.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that's almost a part of genius, and that it's okay. I mean, not, some people do pay a price, you can't, but I still don't think that, in my experience, certainly Black women, white women, Black men, not in the same way, So at least maybe that's a generational difference.
I think, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, someone had a hand up, so you can answer.
I would just say really quickly, the only other thing that I would add, and I think this is building on both the things that you said, is trying to be transparent with my students about choices and knowing that, you know, you can't do everything and everything has, you know, a cost to it. And so just being transparent with my students about how I'm making choices, about spending my time and doing my work and being clear that I can't do everything.
Okay, final, I think someone else had their hand up. Yes, right there.
Yes, so I was wondering if you could talk about, one thing that I noticed that the play addressed was this idea that, you know, Black women and Black professionals are not monolithic, you know, not socioeconomically, not politically even. So, you know, being on campus, which in many ways is self-conflicting, the fact that like sometimes in the liberal bastion there's also a whole lot of conservative sort of structures in place. What is it like, you know, being a Black woman on campus like that, and maybe having expectations that are on you politically speaking, being someone who can show up at the Black Lives Matter shirt? The decision to with the one other person in the institution. So I wanted you to talk more about that in the real world experience.
Well, I have a good Farah story. So I had the pleasure of being a fellow when Farah was running the fellows program at the Schomburg. And at the time, I was an associate professor. And shout out to Kayama, who's here, who's also associate. I think you were associate professor then. And we asked Farah, what is the difference between being a full professor and being an associate professor? And she said, you're freer. And the way that that connects to your question, I think, is that when I'm moving to the university, I feel a great sense of latitude and responsibility because I know that the consequences for my action read differently now than they did 3 years ago or when I first started my career. And so that responsibility and that weight, I'm able to carry it differently because of the way I'm positioned in relation to the institution.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you're freer, and in that freedom comes more responsibility too, right? But I also would say that so much about academia, even amongst Black professors, is not so much. So many acts are performative, and that what I've learned over the years is, you know, quite literally not to judge a book by its cover or the T-shirt it wears, and that my allies, you know, for Black students or for putting forth a progressive agenda can come in the most surprising places. And oftentimes, and also I think one of the things you learn to value is you learn to value who's willing to put in the work to do it, right? And you value the other people who are public too, right? And sometimes those don't have to be exclusionary, but the sort of public kind of, here's the T-shirt and here's a picture of Salamishah and I with T-shirts at a march. I can't breathe T-shirt. I'm all for wearing the T-shirt, but that isn't enough. Like that doesn't tell me enough about whether or not I can count on somebody in the trenches. And sometimes the most conservative presenting people are kind of old-fashioned Negro race men and women. And I can count on them in the trenches. You know? So I think that's how I would answer that question.
One of the things that struck me with this play was the way in which the two Black professors were pit against each other so early on and outside of, in a way, their own relationship, but also outside of their own control. And, you know, there's a weird way, I think, sometimes in academia, it's kind of like, so I compare it to like franchise, you know, sports where there's like, you lose one and then you try to recruit another person and there's like only a number of spots. And it's a really, I don't think people know this because everyone, you know, if you go to college, people have jobs and they teach you, but the way in which there's actually so few roles, there's so few positions. And so it ends up, we end up having to compete against each other for one job at a university somewhere. And so how do we counter that? And I think Farah and Soyica talked about building community, being, you know, outside of these value systems, because it's set up. Or another comparison would be the actors who are competing for the same role. So how do people then create, instead of having to compete, how do you like help each other and support each other and navigate? And so I think that's kind of like an underground culture that really is in the academy, and it's, you know, Black women and Black men, and sharing that. And we grew up in that. All of us grew up in it in a different way. But the other thing is, like, I remember being in a faculty meeting, my old university, and I was, you know, Farah and Soyica knows, in fact, another person screamed at me in the faculty meeting, and I had to control, you know, I couldn't scream back. There's no way that was possible. But I realized in that moment that they weren't just screaming at me, but it's because my senior colleague was no longer there. And so I used to be beloved in the department, like, oh, so she's so nice, And then once the Black woman who had more power, who everyone felt intimidated by for no reason other than her brilliance and genius, once she started retiring, I started to fill her place, and therefore I also became the recipient of their anger and their, you know, it was weird to go from being like beloved to being a threat. I was like, wow, it had nothing to do with me, really. But that's also, you know, so that replaceability, or the way in which we're pit against each other, but also we're seen as like one person, is really kind of striking. So yeah, I think, I don't know, any closing thoughts before we leave? I think we're time's up. This has been really
I want
fascinating.
to see this play again and again and again. It's so good.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
What's up, bro?
We lucky. That's right. We lucky as hell. We got in. Oh, shut up. Hi, partners, just Jasmine.
Thank you there.